had worked on cargo ships for 11 years when I was assigned to the Meridian Star. It was a container vessel that ran the route between Busan, South Korea, and Valparaiso, Chile. 43 days crossing the Pacific. 43 days watching the same gray horizon, the same leaden sky, the same expanse of water that never ends. But something about that voyage was different from the start, something that took me too long to recognize. The Meridian Star was an old ship, built in the 80s, with that smell of rust and fuel that never completely goes away. The hallway walls were painted a pale green that had faded over the years, and the fluorescent lights constantly flickered in certain sections. The crew was small, 23 men in total, mostly Filipinos, 2 Greeks in the engine room, a Ukrainian in the galley, and me, Chilean, as third deck officer. We set sail from Busan on a Tuesday afternoon, with overcast skies and a fine drizzle that made everything look blurry. I remember that as we pulled away from port, I looked back and watched the city lights fade little by little until only darkness remained. And I thought, as I always thought at the beginning of each voyage, that 43 days is a long time to be surrounded by nothing. The first few days were normal. Mechanical routines, cargo inspections, weather reports, watch shifts. The Pacific was calm, almost still, which was unusual for that time of year. The sea looked like a sheet of dark metal extending in all directions. Sometimes we went hours without seeing another vessel. Just water, just silence. It was on the 5th night that I noticed something strange. I was on watch on the bridge from midnight to 4 in the morning. It's the loneliest shift. The watch officer, the helmsman, and me. No one else. The rest of the crew slept in their cabins, several decks below. That night, the sea was completely calm. There was no wind, there were no waves. The ship moved forward with a constant purr of engines, but outside, everything was silent. And then I saw the light. It was a dim, yellowish light, flickering in the distance. I thought it was another ship, maybe a fishing vessel, but when I looked through the binoculars, I saw nothing, just darkness. However, the light was still there, intermittent, as if someone were turning a flashlight on and off in the middle of nowhere. I asked the helmsman if he saw it. He was a Filipino named Rodel, a quiet man who had been at sea for over 20 years. He looked where I was pointing and nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, I see it. What do you think it is?" He shrugged. "Sometimes it happens, lights at sea." He said nothing more, and I didn't insist, but that light bothered me, because it had no explanation. It wasn't on the radar. There were no signals from other vessels. And yet, there it was, blinking, constant. It disappeared after about 20 minutes. The next night, it appeared again. This time, in a different position, closer, it seemed to me. Or maybe it was just my impression. Again, there was nothing on the radar. Again, Rodel saw it too. But this time, he didn't look me in the eye when I asked him. He just nodded and kept looking forward, hands firm on the wheel. I began to feel that something didn't fit. The captain of the Meridian Star was a Greek named Andreas Papadopoulos, a man of almost 60, his face marked by decades of salt and wind. He was serious, efficient, but distant. He didn't talk much with the crew. He spent most of his time in his cabin, reviewing nautical charts or sleeping. When I mentioned the lights to him, he barely looked up from his documents. Reflections. Atmospheric phenomena. The Pacific is strange. And that was all. But I knew they weren't reflections, because the lights weren't still. They moved, slightly, as if someone were walking with them. On the 10th night, I heard a sound. I was in my cabin, trying to sleep. The cabin was small, with a narrow bunk, a metal desk, and a circular window facing the sea. I always slept with the curtains closed. I didn't like looking at the ocean at night. There's something about that darkness that unsettles me. That feeling that something could be watching you from the other side of the glass. The sound was faint, a rhythmic tapping, as if someone were tapping metal with something hard. It came from somewhere on the ship, maybe from the containers on deck, maybe from the stairs. I wasn't sure. I got up. I put on my pants and a jacket. I went out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered as always. The hallway was empty. I walked toward the stairs leading to the deck. The tapping continued, soft, constant, like the ticking of a clock. I climbed up. The deck was dark. Only the ship's navigation lights dimly illuminated the containers stacked on both sides. The wind had picked up a bit, and I could hear the water gently lapping against the hull. But the tapping was still there, closer now. I walked between the containers. Some were rusted, with peeling paint. Others had logos of unknown shipping companies. The tapping came from my left. I approached, and then it stopped. Suddenly, as if someone had stopped tapping at the exact moment I got close. I stood still, waiting, listening, but it didn't sound again. I returned to my cabin. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. The days became strange. Small things, details that maybe shouldn't have mattered, but that began to accumulate. For example, the food.
The Ukrainian in the galley, a man named Victor, always cooked the same 3 meals: chicken with rice, fish with potatoes, meat stew, in that order, every 3 days.
But at some point, he stopped following that pattern. He started cooking fish with potatoes every day for an entire week. And when someone asked him why, he just said he hadn't noticed. Then there were the clocks. Each cabin had a digital clock on the wall, and they all started running slow. Not much. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but enough for you to notice when you checked the time on your phone and then looked at the wall clock. I mentioned this to the captain. He said it was an electrical problem, that he would check it, but he never did. And there were the dreams. Several crew members started having the same dream, or at least very similar dreams. They dreamed they were walking through the ship, through the hallways, climbing stairs, looking for something. They didn't know what, just that they had to find it. And at some point in the dream, they reached a door that shouldn't be there. And when they opened it, they saw water. Just water. Dark. Coming in. I had that dream too. Several times. On the 20th night, one of the Filipinos disappeared. His name was June. He was young, maybe 25. He worked in the engine room. He was quiet, polite, never caused problems. That night he didn't show up for his shift. His cabin mate said he had seen him sleeping when he left for work. But when they went to look for him a few hours later, he wasn't there. We searched throughout the ship. In every cabin, in every hallway, in the engine room, in the galley, in the storerooms. We checked the security cameras, but there was nothing. June simply wasn't there. The captain organized a search on deck. We thought maybe he had fallen overboard, but we found no signs, no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. June had simply gone.
The captain reported the disappearance by radio. The authorities told him to document everything and continue the voyage. They couldn't do anything in the middle of the ocean.
That night, the lights returned. This time, there were 3, arranged in a triangle, floating in the distance, motionless. I looked through the binoculars for almost an hour. They didn't move. They just blinked, synchronized. And then, one by one, they went out. The following days were tense. The crew was nervous. They spoke in low voices. They gathered in small groups. They avoided being alone. I also began to feel that tension. That sensation that something was watching us, waiting. The ship started making noises it had never made before. Deep creaking in the structure. Dull thuds coming from the walls. Sometimes, at night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. But when I went out to check, there was no one, and the lights at sea kept appearing. On the 28th night, I found something in my cabin. It was on my desk. A folded piece of paper. I hadn't left it there. I opened it. There was a single word written in pencil, in shaky letters. Deep. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't know who had left it, or why. I kept the paper. I didn't show it to anyone. 2 nights later, another man disappeared. This time it was one of the Greeks from the engine room. His name was Stavros. A big man, almost 40 years old, strong, experienced. He disappeared during his shift. His partner said he had seen him entering the engine room, but when he went to look for him half an hour later, he wasn't there. Again, we searched throughout the ship. Again, we found nothing. The captain was pale, nervous. He began locking himself in his cabin. Sometimes I heard him pacing back and forth, muttering, but he never came out. The crew started talking about curses, ghost ships, things that shouldn't exist. I didn't believe in that. I didn't want to believe, but I could no longer ignore what was happening. On the 32nd night, I saw something in the water. I was on watch on the bridge, alone. The helmsman had gone down to the bathroom for a moment. I stood looking out the window. The sea was dark, completely black. And then, about 50 meters from the ship, I saw a shape. It was large, much larger than the ship. It moved just below the surface. I could see its silhouette, elongated, dark, like a giant shadow sliding through the water. I stood paralyzed. The shape moved slowly, circling the ship, and then it disappeared. When the helmsman returned, I didn't tell him anything. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I had really seen it. But that night, I heard several crew members talking. Some had seen the same thing. Shapes in the water, shadows that moved, things that shouldn't be there. On the 35th night, they found June. He was in one of the cargo containers, at the back of the ship. The container was sealed. No one should have been able to get in. But when they opened it for a routine inspection, they found him there. He was sitting in a corner, knees against his chest, eyes open, dead. There were no signs of violence, no wounds. He was simply dead. His face had a strange expression, like surprise or understanding. The ship's medic couldn't determine the cause of death. He said maybe it had been a heart attack or a stroke, but he wasn't sure. They sealed the body in a bag, stored it in the cold room. No one talked about it afterward. The last days of the voyage were the worst. The ship seemed different, darker, colder. The hallways felt longer. The stairs seemed to never end. And always, there was that feeling that something was following you. That if you looked over your shoulder, you would see something you didn't want to see. I stopped sleeping. Many stopped sleeping. We stayed awake during watch shifts. We spoke little. We just waited to reach Valparaíso. The lights at sea stopped appearing, but the dreams continued.
When we finally arrived in Valparaíso, 43 days after setting sail from Busan, half the crew resigned immediately. I was one of them.
I never worked on cargo ships again. I never knew what happened to the Meridian Star. I heard it kept sailing, that it had other voyages, other crews, but I didn't care. I didn't want to know. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see those lights in the ocean, blinking in the darkness, and I hear that tapping, that soft, constant sound I could never find. And I think about June, sitting in that container, with his eyes open, looking at something only he could see. There are places in the world where the darkness is so deep you can no longer tell if you're awake or dreaming. And there are things at sea that don't need explanation to exist. I've never looked at the ocean the same way again. It was February 2019 when I boarded the Nordic Empress, a luxury cruise ship that ran the route between Bergen, Norway, and the Svalbard Islands.
I worked as a maintenance technician. 6-month contracts, good pay, few questions. The ship was enormous, 12 decks, capacity for 2,000 passengers.
I slept on E-deck, crew area, narrow hallways with fluorescent light that constantly hummed. The first days were normal. Mechanical routine, pipe inspection, electrical systems, reports. The ship sailed through grey waters, always grey, under a sky that seemed to crush itself against the sea. There was a cold that hurt in the bones, even inside. The passengers were mostly Scandinavian retirees, quiet people who walked slowly through the carpeted hallways, watching the waves through fogged windows. The first time I heard about cabin 347 was in the crew dining hall. I was eating dinner alone when Mikael, a burly Norwegian who worked in security, sat down across from me. He had tired eyes, as if he hadn't slept well in weeks. He asked me if I'd been assigned any tasks on C deck. I told him no, that my area was mainly E and D deck. He nodded slowly, stirring his coffee without looking at it. Then he said something I didn't forget, that if I ever had to go to 347, I should do it quickly, fix whatever it was and leave, not stay longer than necessary. I didn't ask him why. 2 weeks later, I received a work order. Water leak in cabin 347 C deck. The report said passengers had complained about constant dripping in the walls. I grabbed my toolbox and went up. C deck was for passengers, but that area was almost empty. It was the oldest section of the ship, minimally renovated, with worn carpets and a damp smell that never went away. The hallway was silent. Too silent. There was no ambient music like in the rest of the ship. No voices, no footsteps, just the dull purr of the engines and the metallic creaking of the hull. 347 was at the end of the hallway, last door on the left. The gold plate with the number was dull, as if no one had cleaned it in years. I knocked. No one answered. I used the master key. The door opened inward with a soft click. The cabin was empty. Bed made with military precision, towels folded, curtains closed. But the air was heavy, thick, as if it had gone days without ventilation. And it was cold. Colder than in the hallway. I could see my breath. The leak came from the bathroom, drops falling rhythmically onto the sink. I opened the cabinet under the sink and found the cracked pipe. Nothing serious, half an hour of work. But while I was adjusting the wrench, I heard something. A knock. Soft, metallic. It came from the wall next to the bed. I left the tool and approached. I pressed my palm against the wall. It was freezing. I waited. Silence. Then another knock. Closer. As if someone was knocking from the other side, from inside the wall itself. I stepped back. I thought about pipes, water pressure, thermal expansion of metal, logical things. I returned to the bathroom, finished the repair and left the cabin without looking back. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept feeling the cold of that room on my skin. The next day, I checked the occupancy records. 347 hadn't had guests in 3 weeks. Before that, a Danish couple had spent one night and requested a cabin change at 6 in the morning. There was no explanation in the system, just the word, transferred. I asked at reception. The girl attending, a young Polish woman named Kasia, lowered her voice when I mentioned the number. She told me that cabin always caused problems. Vague complaints, noises, cold, feeling of discomfort. Many passengers requested changes without giving concrete reasons. Some simply left in the middle of the night. I asked her if anyone had died there. She was quiet for a few seconds, then shook her head, but she didn't look me in the eyes. A week later, I returned to 347. Another work order, bathroom light flickering. This time the cabin was occupied. An elderly woman, German, about 70 years old. She opened the door slowly, with security chain. She looked at me with distrust, then let me in. The room was exactly the same as last time, too much the same. The curtains closed, the dense air, the cold. The woman hadn't unpacked. Her suitcase was closed by the door, as if she was ready to leave. While I was checking the light, she stood in a corner, hugging herself. I asked her if everything was alright. She nodded unconvincingly. Then, almost in a whisper, she asked me if I had heard it too. I told her, heard what? She looked at me directly, with tired, empty eyes. The footsteps, in the bathroom, always in the early morning. I finished quickly and left. That night, at 3 in the morning, I received a call from security. The woman from 347 had abandoned the ship at the Tromsø stopover. She left everything. Suitcase, documents, clothes. She only took her passport and walked toward the port without saying a word. They didn't assign that cabin again. But I kept going down the sea deck. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe something darker. I would stay in the hallway, in front of 347, listening. Sometimes nothing happened. Other times, I heard the knock, always the same rhythm. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. One night, near the end of my contract, I went down with a master key. It was 4 in the morning. The ship slept. I opened the door to 347 and entered. The cabin was exactly the same, but this time, on the bathroom mirror, there was fog, as if someone had just showered. And in that fog, traced with an invisible finger, there were words in a language I didn't recognize. I ran out. The next day, I spoke with the captain. A dry fin, a man of few words. I asked him directly about 347. He closed his office door and looked at me with a tired, resigned expression. He told me that the Nordic Empress had been built in 1987. In 1994, during a winter crossing, a passenger disappeared. Room 347.
A 40-year-old man, German engineer, traveling alone. The crew searched the entire ship for him. They never found him. Security cameras showed he had entered his cabin and never left.
They checked pipes, ducts, every corner. Nothing. They declared he had fallen into the sea, although it didn't make sense. Since then, that cabin had been a problem. Different crews, different ships after renovations, but always the same thing. Noises, cold, disappearances of objects, and that feeling. The captain told me that some believed the man was still there, trapped somewhere between the walls, between the decks, in a space that shouldn't exist. I finished my contract 2 days later. I never worked on cruise ships again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a closed room, in the silence of early morning, I hear that knock 3 times. And I know that something, somewhere in the ocean, is still looking for the way out.